So, um, I want to use this video as or series of videos because it's going to be the whole linguistic aspect of writing. I'll have to remember that FaceTime will do that. Sorry, doing split screen in a weird way. Have fun. So I want to talk about the linguistic aspect of writing. The first video will be a just a basic introduction, grand scale or grand scheme, macro picture linguistics, and some of the challenges with how language is taught in the U.S. academic culture, K through 12, college, whatever. Some of the challenges. So to get us started, just to give credit where credit is due, I do borrow my linguistic PowerPoint for the time being. I borrow the resource from Professor of Linguistics Pradeep Kumar Das at the Center of Linguistics in New Delhi. I know the book it's built from. I enjoy it, and I have in it the things in it align with scholarship I already know. So I used it instead of reinventing the wheel for the time being. So, as a place to start, when we talk about linguistics, I like to refer to the people who are experts in linguistics. I have it as part of my training and background as a second language writing specialist and a translingual writing specialist. My expertise, my official degrees in writing, rhetorics, and literacies, so I get a lot of the linguistic stuff, but if we're going to pick fights with anyone, we'll let the linguists do the work in this case. Suffice to say, there are people who spend their whole lives studying language, as we just saw. When they do that, what they're studying is, when we talk about linguists and applied linguists, these are specialists who spend their entire lives studying or engaging in scientific study of language or human language. I know some applied linguists who also geek out a little bit and will study languages of animals, dolphins, prairie dogs, and kind of language and community of that, which is kind of interesting. But for the most part, and when we're considering writing, we usually think of human language. So, linguistics is the scientific study of human language, or just language in general. So when you think linguistics, think language. That's one key direct link word. Linguists, and it should be noted, I guess, linguists when they study, when they will spend their whole lives not studying all of linguistics sometimes. Sometimes you'll get specialists who study one component of linguistics for a single language or language variety. And so it can be really neat how deep people will delve when this is their specialization, that there's a lot of room, there's a lot to this content area, this discipline of linguistics. That's why I like to borrow from them instead of kind of taking my writing lens and trying to tell them what I think, if that makes sense, because they are the experts. Applied linguists are the experts on language. That's what they study. I study it, a form of applied linguistics in the form of writing, but I like to draw on them for some of these big picture things. So, again, linguistics, the scientific study of language. Often when linguists study language, they'll ask three questions connected to three big areas. What counts as language knowledge? What counts as how do we acquire that knowledge? And then how do we perform that knowledge? So what is knowledge of language? How is knowledge of language acquired? How is knowledge of language put to use? These are three big questions. And when they're talking about language and when they're talking about study, again, they're not just talking about language as big E English or big S Spanish or big F French or name the language. It is much broader than that. The principles that linguists use to study language are applicable across languages, across dialects, across language varieties. And so that's important to keep in mind, especially as we go to how linguists define what sometimes feels like a dirty word when it comes to writing, because the way writing is taught when it comes to grammar, or grammar is taught when it comes to writing, is kind of broken. We talk about grammar, unfortunately, in a way that is less effective than linguists would. Linguists describe grammar as everything one knows about the structure of one's language. So all your language knowledge. And when we talk about language, this isn't a single language like English. Technically, I'm teaching in an English context, but I'm teaching you about language which is beyond that context. And so a grammar is is not a bunch of rules to follow, even though that's how we teach it, and I'll get to that in a moment. But grammar, when we think about grammar, we need to retrain ourselves to think not a series of rules I have to follow, but a body of knowledge about my language that I can use to gain more knowledge about language and perform that knowledge more effectively. So, uh, what are some of the problems? So, when we talk about grammar, traditional K through 12 system and kind of pop culture in general, or you talk to most people about grammar, and they go, "Oh, my grammar's bad. Oh, I'm a bad writer because my grammar's bad." And so, we can link back to that PTS for writing thing and marking up papers. When we're describing grammar in that way, we're really talking about our ability to align ourselves with a specific cultural norm, a specific language norm or convention. And so we're not talking about grammar the way linguists necessarily would. We're talking about the rules of grammar established by a particular people group, as in, this is what you should do. That's not really a healthy way to think about grammar. It tends to put us in a mindset with our language that, especially if we don't realize it, that there's something wrong with our language if we don't adhere to a specific cultural norm. That's like saying there's something wrong with me because I dress differently than other people. There may be reasons to dress a certain way, but if I'm only doing it because other people will think I look funny, there are value issues there. We have to think through that. So, the variety that is most privileged, and when we talk about grammar norms in the U.S. and the U.S. academic culture, we're really talking about a specific variety of English. Standard written English is usually what it's called, or SWE. It may be more appropriately termed sedimented white or Western English, because that's the people group that it usually gets associated with. Don't get mad at me. There's scholarship. It's not, it just, the reason for that is a bunch of old dead white guys are the ones that we draw on to determine those norms that are grammar rules, and they've been reinforced in society over decades and centuries. So, and we could tie it back to norms built through, for instance, a power text, a power document, the King James Bible from the 1600s, things that were originally written very creatively, like William Shakespeare's works. Even though he was being very creative and experimental with language in his works, we have taken some of his writing and taken those language patterns and said that's the right way to do it, instead of doing what he did, which is experiment with language. More recently, things like Webster's Dictionary and other dictionaries were political moments or rhetorical moments where power moments, sociocultural moments that influenced language. So when we think about grammar, we have to be aware of this context so that if we choose to adhere to academic writing norms, it's okay to realize that comes from a particular culture. And if we're trying to succeed in the academic world, we can make an intentional choice to align with that culture or do something different or break a norm for the sake of our rhetorical purpose, whatever that is. And there's nothing wrong with adhering to that norm or breaking it unless your audience thinks so, or unless you have a reason you want to. Some people will use their grammatical norms or conventions knowledge. They'll use that and intentionally break it because they want to make an identity claim in their paper through language and through grammatical norms. Some scholars, especially with African American vernacular English, Geneva Smitherman, I think Adam Smith, I'm spacing, I feel bad if I got that wrong, are modern scholars who will write entire academic articles in other varieties of English. And so we'll talk a little more about that. But this is the big overview of linguistics. So if you've been trained that that there's something wrong with your language, you're making a bunch of mistakes, and all you think about when you think about grammar is the things you do wrong, then you've been trained up in a common way that can lead to problems. So be careful. We want to shift our definition of grammar to be more along the lines of what linguists and applied linguists would study it as the patterns in language that we notice from it when people share language resources. And so you've got your language, other people have their languages. When your language resources or your knowledge of language overlaps, you'll have more effective communication. or you'll have to work around where they don't. And so when we go to study linguistics, we've got this big thing called grammar that has to do with what we know, everything we know about our language and the structure of our language across sociocultural varieties of language. We have our own personal repertoire, our own personal language profile, and that sort of thing. And we can study that at a cultural level or an individual level with all the various components you see on the screen. Phonetics, phonology, lexicon, morphology, syntax, semantics, pragmatics, and a few others that we'll get to eventually. But this is just the big overview. So linguistics, as a recap, scientific study of language or human language, asks 3 questions. What is the knowledge of language? Competence, or what we know. How is that knowledge acquired, acquisition, and how is that knowledge performed or put to use, language processing and performance. And so when we think as writers, we can use this as these linguistic components or questions to help us develop as writers more effectively, to add to our language profile or add to our language repertoire, so that we can be more effective in the long run. We can make intentional choices about which social norms to adhere to grammatically or otherwise, make those rhetorical choices intentionally to adhere to or break away from those norms, because we now see the patterns and we know how to work them and why they develop and that sort of thing. With that, this will be part 1 of the linguistic aspect of writing as we introduce it, and so I'm not going to dig into any of the components, but we'll stop there.